Here we are with the final episode of PELLA'S wish for a liminal world. We've come a long way, and I'm late for this episode actually. I actually wrote this story a long time ago. It's just that I hate to give excuses, but I just couldn't find the right time to record. So my apologies for that. Anyhow, for any of you who don't know what this series is, it's basically a sleep series, but this last episode of PELLA'S Wish for a Liminal World is actually not meant to be a sleep episode, though it is still a standalone episode, and pretty much all you need to know is that Enzo Bozan, throughout the series, he enjoys lingering around the many liminal spaces throughout this quiet town called PELLA'S Wish. So now in this last episode of PELLA'S Wish for a Liminal World, well, I'm not gonna tell you anything more than that. I don't want to spoil anything. Anyhow, I'm not planning to drag this intro on for too long. The story should start in about a minute. I just wanted to say that Amber Light, aka me, Talhah Fadzillah, fiction author, is moving on to create different kinds of content. That is to say, I've gotten quite good at Blender, which is 3D software, and the art style that I've decided to go with is nothing particularly fancy, so I hope that I'll be able to churn out a fair share of content every week or so. And so now let's move on with the story. Episode 8, PELLA'S Wish. A rattling noise penetrates the silence and takes Enzo Bozan's attention. It is such a soft sound, and yet in the quietness it appears that much louder. Looking back and forth along the endless dark corridor, he searches for where the sound could be coming from. There it is again. What could it be? It rises and falls, an inhale and exhale, and it rattles because it is echoing. What is that? When Enzo turns around once again, he now sees a window in the wall a short walk ahead of him. But he remains still, his stomach in knots. This is not something he wants to see. It is something that will hurt him, that will reopen an old wound. But then again, he must go to it now. It is about time that he takes a closer look at it. And so, with his steps narrow and slow, he proceeds towards the window, all throughout fearing what will greet him when he reaches it. It is predictable what it is, but he hopes it is not what he predicts it is. The rattling noise becomes more pronounced the closer he gets to it, the echoes tapering away. The rising and falling of the sound now clarifies each time, until he knows for sure what it is the sound of. It is of breathing through a respirator, metallic sighs, inhales, exhales, in and out, rising, falling. Enzo stands behind the red frosted glass, the desolation crawling up from his stomach and into his numbed face. It is what he thought it was, and he never knew what to do once he is back here. What can he do? He is hopeless here. Standing closer, he presses his hand and forehead against the window. The figure through the red frosted glass is only a blur through the window. That is all he can see, a red blurry shape. Clenching his fist, he presses his hands and forehead harder against the glass as though he could break through it if he tried hard enough. And then he smashes his fist against it, over and over. The darkness surrounding him engulfs him, and soon his eyes are wide open to the ceiling. For a long moment, Enzo lies still in bed. It is only when his lungs beg him to breathe that he is reminded that he is awake, that where he was before was a dream or a nightmare. Where is the daylight that would usually greet him on a new day, though? Why is his reality as dark as the nightmare before? Sitting up, he casts his gaze to the left. The curtains are open, as well as his window, so where is the daylight? Why are those golden rays not streaming into his home? Why are they not washing away the gloom that occupies his space? He rubs his blurry eyes and focuses. It is because dawn has not yet broken. The darkness has been carried over from the dream and entered his waking life. Dropping his head with a sigh, he closes his eyes, defeated. This gloom might as well encompass his entire day. He lies back down and attempts to go back to sleep, though there is another part of himself fighting against it. The question is whether he would rather face the misery of reality or of a dream. And how is he supposed to sleep anyway, if there are two voices in his head bickering over this question? Sitting back up, Enzo scoots over to the edge of his bed to reach his feet down onto the floor, and then he wraps his head in his hands and stoops down low. Then a flicker of an image of him in the waiting area of a hospital, sitting in a chair, in this very same position that he is sitting now. He smells the strong chemicals in the air, medicines, disinfectants. He sees the fleeting feet of nurses and doctors rushing past him to and fro. To put a stop to the flow of unwanted memories, he peels his eyes wide open and takes a sharp but deep inhale through his nose, and then he throws his gaze across the room to the window again. Now sleep is definitely far from him. By and by, Enzo is brewing himself a cup of black coffee in the kitchen with dark circles around his narrow eyes. When the coffee is ready, he brings it over to the chair by his window and sets the cup on the sill. Then he folds his arms atop the sill and rests his cheek down in his folded arms, fixing his vacant gaze on the self-reflection of moonlight glistening on the porcelain cup. The distant vroom of an approaching vehicle brushes Enzo's ear, and so his eyes wander over in that direction. The glow of headlights penetrate the film of fog down the road, and then a gray sedan emerges, followed by a truck. As the two vehicles pass by Enzo's window, they slow down and eventually stop at the vacant detached house across the road from the unfinished building neighboring Enzo's apartment. A young couple exits the gray sedan, and they begin to extract a few boxes and bags from the back seat and boot of the car. A few moments later, the two truckers exit their heavy vehicle and move towards the back of it, where they open the door and get inside, and they begin to help move some furniture. That lonely house is finally greeting its first occupants after such a long time. Enzo studies the couple, how they wear their tired faces, and yet they manage to smile through it. How happy they are. "Welcome to PELLA'S Wish," Enzo says as though he is talking to them, his chin rested in his palm, but he only says it to himself. "Welcome to the town we always should have been." It was in the train station that Enzo first met her. It was nighttime, though Enzo had just finished overtiming at work, and he could draw a good guess that this girl he was looking at was of the same circumstance. The workforce can be that unforgiving. There weren't many people around, only two others, and so every time Enzo and the girl's gaze met, it was apparent that they were looking at each other. They shared a few awkward smiles as their eyes flew past each other. Enzo hesitated to approach her, and she seemed to mirror his hesitancy. If there wasn't so much distance between them, it would have been much easier. But there they were, seated 2 benches away, far away from each other. For a reclusive lad like Enzo, it would take a lot of courage to cover that much distance just to meet her, and to go about it casually, even. But just as he gathered that much courage, and just as he was standing halfway up from the bench, he heard the train arriving. As they boarded the train, they stared at each other, the girl entering from her side of the platform and Enzo from his side. Inside the train, he slumped into his seat and rested his head back against the backrest, rubbing his forehead and eyes, disappointed in himself. It was too late. He should have approached her much sooner. Now too much time has passed. With his hand over his eyes, he then heard a girl's voice say hi, and so he uncovered his eyes, saw her standing there in front of him, and froze. She asked if she could take a seat, and he nodded, at a loss for words, afraid that his excitement would show if he spoke or moved too much. So she took a seat and then said that he looked tired. This was when Enzo forced some words out of his clammed lips. He stammered and said that his job takes a lot out of him. She laughed and said, "Why can't we just stay on the sleepy train ride till we've got a good long rest, right?" Enzo was now a tad composed. He chuckled and said, "Wouldn't that be just what we need?" She said, "But we are a part of the race called life, aren't we?" Enzo shrugged and nodded, leaning back in his seat, his eyes cast down to his legs. "And very young, so we are all the way back in the line of the race," he added. She asked what he worked as and said that she was an operations executive for a company that organizes corporate events. He was a marketing executive in the local headquarters of a fast food franchise. They both agreed that both jobs sounded too big for how young they were, though they both said that their paychecks were sizable, without disclosing the exact amounts. But they both asked each other, was it worth it? Why were they sticking to their jobs if they are practically taking all their time away? Eventually they agreed that they were too young to know the answer, and that they probably shouldn't leave their jobs just yet. The two of them talked until the next train station was Enzo's stop, and so he told the girl that he was getting off soon. She said that it was her stop too. Where did she stay? 2 blocks down from Turnison Cafe. Everyone who lived in the area knew the place. It was a block away from the upcoming station, Station Vincent 11. As it turned out, Enzo lived 2 blocks down from her place. How could we have not bumped into each other before? Too busy, perhaps, she said and shrugged. Too busy getting where we needed to go. It takes the last train home for us to finally meet. And I'm glad we did, Enzo smiled. Me too, she returned the smile. Enzo walked her to her place. Under the warm white downlights at the entrance of her apartment, they exchanged numbers and stood there in awkward silence for a long moment, reluctant to leave each other's company but too shy to do anything about it. He looked at the surrounding trees, buildings, lampposts, and then he looked at her and said he'd better get going. "I'd better get some shut-eye. Let's meet again sometime," he said, walking backwards and waving at her. She only stared at him, a daydreamer smile resting on her lips. Enzo parks his car at Daydream Plaza and kills the engine but remains inside, his hands on the steering wheel, his blank, droopy eyes fixed onto the dashboard. What is he doing here? He had driven here rather unconsciously and didn't know what to do now that he was here. How much time did he spend lingering in these empty places? Is he finally getting tired of doing this every day? Resting his chin on the steering wheel, he shifts his gaze up from the dashboard to look at the plaza. He stares at it, at how inactive it is, how lifeless. And just as he thought it was empty as it could ever be, a car pulls up in the parking space beside him. He looks inside the car and sees the art gallery keeper who, in Enzo's presumption, is actually the owner of the gallery as well as the artist of the paintings displayed. She kills the engine and exits the car, but just as she is about to walk over to the plaza, she stops and looks through the open window at Enzo, not knowing that he was there watching her the whole time. She says hi and Enzo returns the greeting, but she doesn't move on from there. She stands there, looking at him, puzzled, and then she finally asks him if she can join him. Enzo returns the puzzled frown back to her, softens his voice and asks what she means. Join him in what? She gestures towards the passenger seat beside Enzo and asks again if she can join him. He looks at the empty seat and then back at her, nods and says sure. Enzo's first date with the girl from the train station was at the end of the week they first met. It was Saturday night. He had showed up where he dropped her off the last time, at the entrance of her apartment building. To double-check that he was at the right place at the right time, he opened his text messages with her on the phone. He also double-checked their agreement to not dress up too nicely. They didn't doubt that it was a date, but they had both admitted that they acted differently when dressed formally and in a formal setting. They hadn't even planned what was for dinner. All in all, it was going to be an ad-lib night. Enzo slipped his phone back into his jean pocket and looked up into the light of the tall street lamp above him, and then he checked his reflection in the window of an empty car parked beside the street lamp. He straightened the collar of his polo shirt, pushed his hair back in place, breathed into his palm to smell his breath. It smelled of mints. A minute later she came down. She waved at him with a big smile on her face, though her eyes showed that she was just as tired as he was at the end of a hard week at work. She rolled the cuffs of her baggy hoodie up to her elbow and walked over to him. Only when they weren't dressed in their work clothes, he realized how young they actually were. It hadn't dawned on him before now, and whether she wasn't wearing as much makeup as the day they first met, or she wasn't wearing any makeup at all. This was mostly the reason she looked all the more youthful. When she reached him, standing on the walkway, she raised her brows, puckered her lips, and looked up at the sky. With her hands interlocked behind her, she laughed and said, "We don't really have a plan for where to go tonight, do we?" Enzo smiled and said, "Aren't we tired of planning where we need to be anyway?" She chuckled and started walking along the walkway with her hands tucked into the hand warmers of a hoodie. Enzo walked beside her and they avoided talking about work. Talking about work would have spoiled the night. Whatever they needed to know about each other's work life was already showing in their tired faces. Instead, they shared conversations that should seem boring, but they didn't find as such. Enzo told her about the time he used to hang out at his dad's office. His dad was running a magazine publication business with his brothers. It was a small business, and so the office wasn't anything too grand. It had blue carpeting throughout the floor and it constantly smelled of strong coffee. It was there that Enzo had had his first taste of black coffee. It was bitter and he never would have known that he was to be addicted to it. While Enzo was relating this inconsequential story to her, they stopped walking and she leaned back against the concrete wall. She wore the same daydream smile that she wore the other night. This girl was different. Enzo could tell her the most boring thing and she would listen to it completely. And so he continued to tell her about an abandoned but quaint little house that he came across when he was a teenager. And she just listened. He told her, in as much detail as he could remember, about the dull and dim paintings in the living room, how they looked valuable like they belonged in an art gallery, and yet it was left here unattended in this abandoned home. Then she told him about a mall she used to live nearby, a dying mall. She used to go there to buy some groceries with her brother. The grocery was on the 3rd floor, which was the second to the emptiest floor in the mall. The further up the floors, the emptier it got. It was a 5-story high mall with the 5th floor having nothing but empty shop lots. She told him that once she and her brother went all the way up there out of curiosity, and they found that, indeed, there was nothing there but empty shop lots. They continued walking, remembering only when the evening had become late that they hadn't had any dinner yet. And so the first diner that they came across, they went to it. It was a place that they had often passed by, having lived not so far from it, though they hadn't spent much of thought on it before. It wasn't particularly the kind of place that would catch their attention, especially when the only times they were walking around the area were when they have somewhere else to be. Tonight was the first time they had actually visited the quiet diner. There were only 3 other patrons, each of them alone in their own worlds. Sleepy eyes casted down to the edge of the tables, cheeks in their palms. Enzo and the girl took a seat in the booth by the window, and then the waitress came along and passed them the menus. They ordered cheeseburgers and talked about the boring diners, restaurants, and food courts they'd been to in their lifetime. They stayed there until the evening grew even later, and then the diner closed. Then they wandered along the walkways outside until they were far from their homes and they doubled back. It was the first of many pleasant nights he'd spent with her. Nothing exciting or fun hardly ever happened between them. They were content enough with each other's boring ways, and so in that sense they were a mature couple. At one point, in one of their later dates, they mentioned that they always imagined they'd end up in a more exciting relationship, but that this was just what they never thought they wanted. The artist asks Enzo what he does around here. He shrugs and says nothing much. "I just wander around, zone out, that's pretty much all." She nods and looks down at the glove compartment. She asks if it's working. "Not anymore." "How do you stay afloat?" "I used to run a business with my wife." "Your wife? Where is she now?" Enzo keeps silent. When the question fades, unanswered, she nods and apologizes for having asked. Softening his voice, he then says, "Not to sound rude or anything, but what brings you into a stranger's car?" You're definitely stranger than a stranger, she laughs, but I'm just as strange to have sat in your car, aren't I? He chuckles and she says that she's seen him around several times before, since the time he'd bought one of the paintings from a gallery. Each time I saw you, always alone, always looking lost, I grew all the more curious, and so this is what brings me into your car today. He eyes her profile. How long have you been in this town? 2 years. Opened up my gallery 5 months ago. Her eyes graze past an engraving near the radio, and so she stops to read it. All in lowercase letters, except for the P and W. It reads, "Welcome to PELLA'S Wish, the place we always should have been." He asks her, "Why'd you set up your gallery here, of all places?" "I know," she says, "doesn't seem much like a place for business. But I don't make much money on the ground either way, mostly online. So why here?" "I just like the place, simple as that. It doesn't make much sales, but I think it fit more as an office in a way, or a studio. It's a place of inspiration, where I can just zone in on my work, you know? You painted all those paintings in your gallery yourself, didn't you?" "How could you tell?" "They're too much a niche to be found in any other commercial galleries. Too underground. I'd imagine you wouldn't get much success unless you went your own way, ran your own business. Which, I assume, is exactly why you did it. Because you've tried other galleries and none of them worked out for you. Only someone who admires the kind of art would understand. And you're just the kind of person who'd buy them, aren't you?" He grins and says, "I'm your biggest fan." The two of them stare off at Daydream Plaza in silence until the lady says a name, Yara, and she asks him honestly, "What brings you to this quiet town?" He says that she can ask her the same thing. She restates that she simply likes the quiet place, and that he can have the same answer, of course, but that his reason has roots that run deeper than hers. She can tell. Call it an artist's intuition. His reasons are intricate vines of sorrow, delight, bitterness, sweetness, all of them intertwined and winding. Her reason is that she simply likes the silence. And she hates to be intrusive, especially with someone she just met, but she is eager to know. Call it an artist's insatiable hunger for complex sensations. For a minute more, they stare off at the Daydream Plaza, but she smiles like a wide-eyed child knowing that he will tell because he is tired of keeping the secret. With his lack of sleep apparent through his heavy-lidded, ruddy eyes, he looks at her in a kiddish temper, and he tells her that she's right. "You're smarter than I was at your age," he laughs, a sharp exhale through his nose. "I wish we were as smart as you are." "We? Who is we?" She puckers her brow, her question soft as a whisper, brief as a gasp. She asked him to tell, and he will, but she hadn't thoroughly considered the effect it will have on him, to open up to her. How nosy she must seem. Funny that he calls her smart. If a curious artist is an itch, they will scratch it. He asks if she'd like to take a walk, and so she nods, shy and stiff. With that, they exit the car and begin slow steps towards the plaza they've been admiring from afar the whole time. They look up at the gray sky, the thin and scant sun rays fighting through the heavy fog to touch the ground. They watch the dried leaves rustling past them in the cool breeze. Everything is slow, a heavy, lingering atmosphere. And then he begins with, "We met at the train station. It was the last train home." He asks Yara her age and she says 28. He says that they were 23 when they met, his wife and him. She asks when they got married. Your age, actually. And we quit our hectic jobs a year later. Yara looks down at her shoes and then Enzo goes on to say that was when he and his wife started their own business together, an advertising agency. Yara frowns and says, "Isn't that one of the most stressful industries to get into?" Shrugging, Enzo says that that's precisely why he wishes they were as smart as she is. "Why do you say that? How am I any smarter than you were?" "Well, you figured out what you wanted sooner than we did." "What is it that you wanted?" "What you have, basically. It really is that simple, really. You wake up in the morning, you come here to this quiet place, you work there in your gallery. Not many customers come in, but that's not what you came here for anyway. You make most of your income online. You simply wanted to be here. Maybe you're not making a ton, but you're going at a healthy pace. If any stress comes your way, it's the kind you're capable of handling. Isn't that what everybody wants? Oh, not everybody. We thought we wanted the big numbers, big cars, big houses, this and that. That's what most people want, or at least think they want. We worked our way up to that point, in fact, and I can't afford those things. But now I'm more content staying in a little studio apartment here in PELLA'S Wish. Isn't that funny? Yara stops walking, and so Enzo turns around to look at her. With a frown on her face, she asks him what's PELLA'S wish. Enzo closes his eyes, sighs, bows his head, and then giggles. It's funny, huh? In my mind, I called this town PELLA'S Wish so many times I actually said it out loud. They start walking again, and he continues saying that even when he came across the town's real name on signboards or on posters and whatnot, he'd always read PELLA'S Wish. He asks Yara if she thinks he's gone crazy. Yara shrugs and says that that's impossible. I think you're saner than a lot of people out there, quite honestly. But why do you call this town PELLA'S Wish in the first place? As Enzo talks, he only looks down at the ground ahead of him. Pella was her name, he says. She passed away 6 years ago. Cancer. Yara catches up with him, walks beside him and apologizes, bowing her head. I'm sorry for what happened. Cancer's a bitch. Took my cousin too. And I'm sorry for making you tell me all this. I don't know what got into me. He shakes his head and says that he is glad that he can finally tell someone, and that he is glad to have a company right now. Yara nods. So her name was Pella. Pretty name. So what's the wish about PELLA'S wish? They reach the entrance of the Daydream Plaza and enter the empty place. They walk past 4 vacant shop lots before Enzo begins explaining. At Pella's bedside, he sat there as she slowly wasted away. She was all feverish, blurry-eyed, feeble. Her mind was bobbing in and out of memories and dreams and everything in between. And she'd remind him of all the times they'd come across places like this, like Daydream Plaza, like Little Boulevard Station, like Lights Out Diner. All of these dull, vacant places. These places we sped past them like we were being chased. She'd tell me, with her eyes unfocused, that we should spend more time being in those moments. But they were always thinking and talking about how they were going to own that grand big house and that fancy car. This one time, while Enzo stayed with her and listened to her slow, fading breath, she whispered about the stairwell at her client's office, and she smiled. She asked him if they sat there before, because in her mind, they did. Enzo shook his head. We never sat there, no. She said that she just had an image flash across her eyes of them sitting there together. We should have stayed there a while longer, she'd tell me. There were several other times that she did this, all of the most random places that Enzo had nearly trashed from his memory. She reminded him of their first date, when they just wandered around, lingering wherever they wanted to, talking about nothing particularly interesting. And then she reminded him of the train station where they met, and of one of the first things she said to him. Why can't we just stay on this sleepy train ride till we've got a good long rest? This was the last thing she said to me. Later that morning, he went down to get himself some coffee. When he came back up, she was flatlined. So, if you want to know what the wish in PELLA'S wish is about, this is it. Enzo leans back against the wall beside an empty shop lot. This is PELLA'S wish. Yara leans beside him and asks how long he's been here. 5 years. Kids? None. Couldn't have any. Sorry to hear that. So, what's next? I don't know, Yara. 57 years old, retired, nothing to do. Yara stares at the man, 57 years old, no kids, nothing to do. Here he is, every day for the past 5 years, thinking that he's fulfilling his dead wife's wish by doing nothing here. Maybe he is crazy, but that's just what grief can do. This is just sad. She looks into the darkness ahead of them. What can she do for him? She wants to offer him her opinions. She wants to tell him that he misinterpreted Pella's dying wish. Pella wouldn't want him to waste away, doing nothing but lingering in empty places for the rest of his life. She only wished they'd spend more time being in the moment, together. Obviously, Yara can't just barge into his sensitive private matters that way and offer him her own opinions about it. But she doesn't need to tell him to it like that. Standing in front of him, she folds her arms and says, "Follow me up to the gallery." He tilts his head to the side and stands away from the wall, gesturing for her to lead the way. And so they head up to her gallery on the second floor. Yara lifts the shutters and unlocks the glass door, then locks it again when they enter. She shows him to her workspace, a room behind the counter that looks smaller on the outside but that is relatively larger inside. Enzo stands at the far end of the room, looking at her impressive assembly of technology that look rather high-end. One is a large 3-in-1 printer, another a large graphic tablet. Her desktop computer is associated with 2 large monitor screens. He already knows she makes most of her money online, but she definitely is more well-versed in technology than he thought. She leads him to the middle of the room, over to the chair in front of a canvas and stand. Without saying a word, she goes over to the table on one side of the room and prepares some painting equipment for him to use. And then she begins teaching him, starting with how to hold a brush, all the way up to techniques and color theories. Hours later, she sits there behind and slightly beside him, observing how he carefully handles the paintbrush like an old man with bad eyesight trying to write a letter. She smiles, thinking about her own father. Thank you for listening to the final episode of Pella's Wish for a Liminal World. Until next time.